Hello and welcome to this mini topic series on Beyond Use Dating. This is Kim Burns and let's get started. Just as a reminder of what the purpose of the mini topics are, is to basically supplement your textbook readings, lecture slides, notes, discussions, anything else that's assigned or that we're doing basically in class or outside of class. So what I'm going to do is go over some key points on a topic that one may find confusing. This may help clarify. But the quick information is basically the who, what, when, where, why, and how. So this brief presentation does not represent or include all the information expected on the topic for this course. So what are expiration dates and what are beyond use dates? So this is how the FDA describes it. And basically you have an expiration date, which reflects the time period which the drug product is known to remain stable, retains its strength, quality, and purity when it's stored according to labeled storage conditions. That's the label, if you will, and the labeling of the manufacturer. So the FDA, through the drug approval process, requires stability testing from the manufacturer. So they have to do studies and explain to the FDA what this should be, and this is approved by the FDA, and that's the expiration date that they're allowed to put on the package. So again, this is a manufacturer's package. So this is often referred to the manufacturer's expiration date, okay? Put some pictures down there for you to see. That's the manufacturer's box and bottle. A beyond use date is the date beyond which a drug product should not be used. So these are required to be assigned in various circumstances depending on the activity. Now today or on this presentation, I'll mention a few common ones, but there's plenty others as well too. But basically a beyond use date is generally shorter than the manufacturer's expiration date and never should be longer than that date as well too. And exactly how you determine really depends on numerous factors. So you just can't say this is how you do a beyond use date and it applies to everything. You really have to look at a number of things. But the way I like to think about it is when you have this manufacturer's bottle or packaging or container and it has their expiration date on it, okay, that means obviously the patient shouldn't use it past that date. If so, it's not guaranteed to be pure and stable. That doesn't mean it goes from 100% to 0% overnight, but and in fact, there's studies out there that show oftentimes drugs stay stable even after that. But those are dates that we use. Obviously, we can't dispense medications from a manufacturer's packaging past that expiration date. So the beyond use date, you should think about any time you take drugs from a manufacturer's bottle and move it into something else, okay? And we'll talk about what that something else is, or you mix products together out of a manufacturer's container. Anytime you remove a drug or you take it out of there, right, what's going to happen is that expiration date that the manufacturer did studies on, they did studies on that for that container or that packaging. So you just can't assume when you take a product out of its manufacturer's bottle, which has an expiration date, and you move it somewhere else, that it's going to retain that same expiration date. So if you can think about it that way, right, it's stable within the bottle of the manufacturer because they did studies on it in that packaging, but once you remove it, things can change. So these are the ones I just want to talk about in this mini topic is some common pharmacy practice activities that do require beyond use dating. So the first one I want to talk about is pharmacy repackaging medications into unit dose containers for later patient use. That's pretty common in long-term care facilities and health settings or hospital settings. Then I want to touch on just briefly the pharmacy compounding medications. That's another time that we have to assign BUDs, and we can break that up into sterile and non-sterile compounding. Then we have removing a medication from the manufacturer's original container and place it into another container, which is going to be directly dispensed to a patient, so like the pharmacy vial. All right. So when a pharmacy repackages medications into unit dose containers for later patient use, so let's say you're in a hospital or health system and you buy the manufacturer's bottle of 100, you're going to maybe put those in little unit doses or some type of packaging that then is eventually going to be used for a patient when it's ordered. So that is termed repackaging. Now, repackaging means other things in other places to other companies and organizations and things like that. But that term is also used here as well. So you can see down below, I put some pictures. So for example, this may be a unit dose. So those pills that are in that little yellow packet there probably came from a manufacturer's bottle, and now the pharmacies put them in these little packaging, and then when they get an order, like in the health system or wherever it's at, they can just pull one of those and they can send it up to the floor for the patient to have there without having to send up the manufacturer's bottle or do a separate prescription and a label for like one pill. So you can see here that there's some common types of packaging. The ones in the middle are probably more for like a long-term care facility or an assisted living facility where you're going to send about a month's worth. Sometimes you might do that for like a week or 2 weeks. And then on the far right is a picture, if you will, or a shows you what might be the machine that is doing the repackaging. There's all different kinds. That's just a picture of one of them. So again, when you move from the manufacturer package, so let's say you have a bottle of 100 from a manufacturer's bottle, moving it into one of these packaging, and again, this is just one example, basically you can't assume that that manufacturer expiration date of the product still always remains the same. In 2017, the FDA put out some guidance that has some information about beyond use dates for the example that I'm talking about. The website's on the top right, and then the title of the guidance documents there too. It says repackaging of certain human drug products by pharmacies and outsourcing facilities. So outsourcing facilities are 503Bs, and there's additional information in there for them. But this example that I'm talking about right now, where a pharmacy basically repackages into a like a unit dose or a container to eventually use for a patient prescription or drug order, that's what I'm talking about here for the top drug products by pharmacies. So the this guidance is pages long, so I just want to pull out a couple of things to mention briefly. So FDA regards packaging, this is from there, as the act of taking a finished drug product from the container in which it was distributed by the manufacturer and placing it into a different container without further manipulation of the drug. It also includes the act of placing, and you can see there, taking multiple ones, putting in the same product or the same container. And then it says what's not considered repackaging, so like reconstitution is not. So this is kind of, I don't want to say their definition, right? But they're explaining to you that this is what they consider repackaging. And then they go into saying about how they understand that it's performed by multiple entities, which other entities have their own guidance as well too. And in this guidance document, it will say specifically what this is for. And that does include state licensed pharmacies, such as retail, community, hospital ones. So basically, these pharmacies or other facilities that specialize in these repackaging of drug products. They also mentioned that repackaging is done for a variety of reasons, right? So it could be a good thing in some circumstances or needed in some types of circumstances. So you can read them here as well too. So this guidance, if you will, covers this topic that I'm talking about under number 1. So that's why I bring it up. And you can see down at the very bottom, it says examples of repackaging include tablets and capsules that are repackaged from large containers into small containers or blister packs. That's what we're talking about here. So from that guidance, this is basically what the FDA says. So when you repackage things, you're taking things out of the manufacturer bottle, putting it in a different container. That actually implicates the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act. And you have to think about misbranding. You have to think about, are you meeting current good manufacturing practices? Are you meeting the labeling requirements that the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act expects on a tablet or a pill or a cream? So the FDA said that they won't enforce certain provisions against pharmacies if they meet the following. So first, the prescription drug product is packaged by a state licensed pharmacy. The product is distributed only after the receipt of a valid prescription for an individual patient from a prescriber. So maybe in a health system, they take a 100-size bottle of a tablet, they put them into those little yellow packs that we saw, right, one each, and they're sitting there. And then you're waiting for a prescription to come in, and then you're going to provide it to the patient. But that's after you get a prescription. That's very important, because if that pharmacy is then going to take those single packs and distribute to another facility, okay, then that's not this type of repackaging. That's a different type of repackaging. That's more of a distribution function, okay? And they have their own guidance. So on this example, we're really just focusing on health systems that are repackaging for use for their own patients at a later time. Then the FDA says, so that's fine, you can repackage state licensed pharmacy, you're going to use it for a patient's prescription when it's received, and the repackaged drug product container is assigned an appropriate beyond use date. But how do you determine that beyond use date? So first you need to look at the manufacturing labeling or the scientific information out there, because maybe they provide a beyond use date. If you look at the manufacturer labeling, it says if you take it out and you repackage it into, a different type of container, you shouldn't put a date more than a week or two on it, right? You obviously have to go with that because they've done the studies and they understand that. But you always don't have that information, okay? So if not, then what do you follow? So the beyond use date assigned, first of all, can't conflict with anything in that product labeling. So first of all, like I said, does it give a date? But then also it might say you can't repackage in a certain type of container, okay? So you also have to watch for that too, if there's anything in the labeling of that. Then you need to follow USP chapters 797 and 795 to determine the beyond use date. Basically, you use that date or the expiration date by the manufacturer, whichever is shorter. So if you have an expiration date of a drug, which is good for 2 years, and whatever standard you're using, let's say, is a year, well, obviously you would use the year because that's before the 2 years. So if you go to this guidance, it gives some examples, it gives additional details. I'm not here to go over everything, but I do want to point out one thing, because it basically gives the examples for tablets or those solid dosage forms. It says the beyond use date is to be the earliest of 6 months from the time the container is opened, use of the in-use time on labeling if available, or the expiration date on the large container, whichever is sooner. So what this means is that when a pharmacy opens up that container of the manufacturers, the beyond use date can't be beyond 6 months from that. Now, if they do have an in-use time on the labeling, you can use that, right? So again, that might be earlier 6 months, but it can't be more than 6 months. And you can also look at the expiration date on the large container of the manufacturer. So whether it's the in-use time, if it's available, the 6 months, or the expiration date on the large container of the manufacturer, you need to go with the earliest one. So that's just one example that is common for pharmacies to do, like I said, for long-term care facilities and healthcare systems. Now, there's some contradictions from basically what pharmacy practice, especially in the long-term care facilities and the health systems, were doing for years. So when this guidance came out, ASHP put some things out in, as well as some other ones, but I picked this one from ASHP because basically what they said is that a guidance issued by FDA back in this 12th of January of 2017 makes clear that the agency does not favor some longstanding habits of pharmacy personnel related to the repackaging of drug products. So what happened is this guidance basically contradicts some things that we commonly did in pharmacy practice. So the profession is aware of this. 2 examples is how I just mentioned, when you first open up the original container, you go 6 months from there. That's not what pharmacy practice was typically doing. It's when they took it out of the manufacturer's bottle and repackaged it is when the 6 months start, or when the time frame started. But maybe the manufacturer's bottle was already open for a couple weeks or something like that. The other thing is where the FDA says 6 months, pretty much across the country, the well-known standard was 1 year or the expiration date, whichever is sooner. So you have basically the FDA being a little bit stricter here, and the time you start counting the 6 months is the time the bottle opens at the manufacturer, and then also the 6-month dating versus the 1 year, which was commonly used. So the Drug Quality Security Act impacts this topic. There's more on it in that ASHP article if you want to read that, and obviously that law was passed in 2013. The question remains is, will the FDA release guidance specific to hospital and health system repackaging? Because again, this guidance kind of goes against what we've always done in practice. So currently, if you go by the FDA standard, it's stricter than what we're used to doing. So we're kind of, okay, what's the best way? So if you go to a facility and they're doing the 6 month and they start the counting as soon as the bottle opens, or if they're doing it the way it used to be, you may still see both out there, but the FDA is obviously the strictest. And a caveat is you always have to look at your state law, because sometimes state law addresses these topics as well too. Now, I'm not going to sit here and read this next slide. This was from USP 1146. It's one of their chapters. I just cut basically a couple paragraphs out. And this refers to repackaging of solid drug products, such as tablets or capsules. So you can see the chapter was titled Packaging Practice, Repackaging a Single Solid Oral Drug Product into Unit Dose. So that would be the example that I was just talking about for the long-term care or the health system, okay? And you can see in here they give definitions, and on the very bottom, they have a section on beyond use date. And basically their standard in there is the 1 year or the manufacturer's expiration date, whichever is sooner. So that's where that 1 year standard came from, and it's actually a USP standard that it was as well too. So that's where that came from, and that's been around for a long time. So whether or not, what's going to happen to all this, I guess the practice is saying we'd like to see a guidance specific for this, right? Because you're going off this other guidance, which is really goes against what we're used to and maybe stricter than what it needs to be as well. So for beyond use dates for compounding medications, right, this is another time you have to think about for beyond use dates. It is provided that the beyond use date is when a compounded preparation must not be used and must be discarded, right? So it's different from the expiration date on the manufactured drug. Okay, the expiration date reflects the stability of a product as prepared by the manufacturer and approved by the FDA. The beyond use date is the last date when a compounded product can be used safely. Now, historically, it's based on the manufacturer recommendations, published clinical literature, or limits set by USP. So given that we're compounding things, putting together, pretty much the standards are going to be USP. So USP 795 and 797. 795 are going to set the non-sterile compounding. 797 is going to set the sterile compounding. So again, on the next slide, I'm going to show you here, because there's been some recent controversy with the USP. We had our standards, I guess, that were put in place years ago, and then there were some revisions, and then there was some concern with how those revisions were done. So there were some appeals, went through the legal processes, and then they were agreed upon, and then it was decided that those were going to be enforceable as of November 2023. So we're past that time frame, so they are enforceable. The new revised USP 795, 797, which included updates to BUDs. Now, does your state enforce those? If it says it enforces the most current chapters of USP, yes. Some states have their own, I guess, compounding standards. So they might have taken that and wrote it into their statutes. So they might have to update it on their own time frame, if you will. So you always have to check and see exactly what your state actually says. So it might take a little bit of time, if you will, depending on that. So always check exactly where you're at, where you're practicing, what it is. But in general, the most current version of USP is what I'm going to talk about in the general sense. And that's where we're at right now, is because it's past 2023 of November. Alrighty, so here is a little charts, I guess, showing you the beyond use dates for USP 795 and USP 797. So there was some updates to these a few years ago, and I guess So you can see from 795, it was from 2014 was the last revised, and then the updated one was published in 2019, and then for 797 it was 2008, and then 2019. So in 2019 there were some appeals to these on a number of issues. One of them was the beyond use dates, and then it went through the courts and everything. And then it was finalized, and then the enforceable date was agreed upon as November 2023. So as of that, these updated dates of 2019 were enforceable. So what that means is that assuming your state is using the up-to-date ones, these are the ones that you're going to be using. However, some states had the versions prior, or maybe they had their own version. So I guess the caveat is you got to see where you're practicing, which version you're using. Is it the most up-to-date? Is it a variation? What does your state say? So I don't want to say everyone everywhere is using the most up-to-date one in terms of this one, the USP standard, because there might be some type of variation. But in general, I wanted to show you that this is what is going on, okay? So that is where we are right now, given that we are past November of 2023. So the last one I wanted to mention was dispensing the pharmacy container. So you have your manufacturer container or packaging in the pharmacy, on the pharmacy shelf, and you get a prescription for a patient. Either they drop it off, it gets called in, it's electronically prescribed, and you go through the dispensing process. You enter it, you process it, you get a label, you go pull the drug off the shelf, you count the pills, you put it in the pharmacy vial, you put a pharmacy label on it. Again, you've now taken that drug from the manufacturer container and now you've put it into your pharmacy vial. Now that's not repackaging, okay, by the definition that we saw earlier, because you're not, just let it sit there, okay? You're not distributing it, right? You actually are preparing this for a patient-specific prescription. So this is not repackaging. However, we still might have the issue of, okay, something's coming out of the manufacturer's container, and now we have to think about, does it going to hold that expiration date? So in some circumstances, the pharmacist may be required to put a date on the pharmacy label for the patient to be aware of, depending on which drug and other things. First, you need to look to the manufacturer labeling if it's available, because the manufacturer may say when dispensed, tell patient expires in 30 days, let's say. You would have to tell the patient that. Then you also want to refer to your state law and rules, because a good number of states do address this issue. They might term it different than beyond use date. Like they may say you have to give the patient a use by date. They may say you have to give the patient a discard by date. And then they might also tell you how to determine that date. For example, a number of states are 1 year or manufacturer date, whichever is less. So there's other states, though, that might have you use expiration date if the manufacturer's expiration date is less than a certain time frame. So again, you really need to look to your state laws to determine, number one, if you have to put something on the pharmacy label, and number two, how do you determine that, okay? And again, this is not considered repackaging like we just talked about. So in summary, you have your expiration dates, which are the manufacturers. You have the beyond use dates, which are not the same thing. Sometimes they might be the same date, but they're not the same topic or concept. Pharmacists may need to calculate beyond use dates depending on what's going on and exactly what activities are being done. Then if you do have to calculate one, how do you calculate it? Well, again, that depends on the activity, but common ways that you do use a calculation include referring to, number one, the manufacturer labeling, state laws or rules, FDA guidance, or USP chapters, again, depending on what activity you're doing. Could be one or more of those. Now, as I mentioned, these are only 3 types of activities that could require a beyond use date, but there's other types of repackaging, there's other types of practitioners, there's distributors, there's other, things, drugs, specialty products going on. 503B pharmacies that also have their own guidance for things. So this is not the end all of beyond use dates. So, you can't take what I just talked about here and apply it to a licensed repackager, which is also an FDA registered licensed repackager and distributor, because they're now repackaging with the intent to give to another facility. So they're like the middleman. Okay, so they have a different guidance. And the 503B pharmacies and the radiopharmaceuticals are just a few examples that have additional guidance or requirements. Okay.